Okay, so the first thing you'll need is a template. I found a 3D model on ArtStation that someone made that worked really well, and I'll link a flat screenshot in the description that you can print out. You'll want to print something out that fits your hand size. I usually do a few test prints until I get something that looks about right. And then will slowly start cutting all the individual pieces out. So I cut off the trigger area, and you want to break the gun into layers. So I'm gonna have the thick base layer of 5mm foam, and then layer on more things on top of that. Next I cut out the gold wing bit. And then I just folded some of the other sections to help it fit onto my 5mm foam. I used 3 sheets of 5mm foam for the inner piece of the gun. You just pin them to the foam, trace around it. And then cut. You'll either want a grinder or sharpener or some fine grit sandpaper to keep your box cutter sharp, because the foam dulls it really quickly. Otherwise, you're just gonna need a bunch of different blades to be able to get a smooth cut. So you'll see me off in the corner sharpening my knife a lot. And yeah, it looks good so far. I like the shape, so I traced it on to 2 other sheets of foam that I had. The color doesn't matter, but white's definitely easiest to see the trace marks on. Make sure they all line up. So next comes gluing them. So first, quickly heat them with the heat gun to close the foam pores up so that less glue gets soaked in. And then this glue takes about 20 minutes to dry, so I would usually just watch an episode of anime, and then that would be the perfect amount of time to wait. I spread the glue around just with a scrap piece of foam so I don't waste a brush on the glue. It seems to work pretty well. So once dry, stick them together. They won't line up perfectly, most likely, and that's okay. We'll fix that in sanding. While I was waiting for this to dry, I started cutting out other parts of the gun. So we'll kind of just repeat the steps of cutting stuff out and tracing it onto foam. This is 5mm foam again. Sometimes a smaller X-Acto knife helps with these smaller cuts too, so it's good to have both. Looks good. I cut out another piece that I want raised and mark the kind of rivets and details in reverse because they're going on opposite sides, so they should be mirrored. I cut that little piece out of 2mm foam so that it would be thinner. By this point, it had been drying for a long enough time, so I stuck that together. Trimmed some extra foam off. And then I started sanding it, which unfortunately is out of frame for a lot of this, because I usually sand over a vacuum hose to scoop up the dust as I go. I was also pressing it just to make sure it's flat. Looks like next I cut out the kind of black metal piece. And since I cut out the wing part, I just drew my own line. Mark the rivets again. Testing out the different pieces. And making one for the other side. Next I did the silver piece. The round curves took a really long time to cut out with the X-Acto knife. And yeah, it's pretty much just repeating the same steps over and over. Cut out each individual piece on the gun, breaking it into small parts, cutting those out into foam. All in all, this prop took me 15 hours to make, not including painting. But if you're faster at cutting with your X-Acto knife than I am, I think you could get it done faster. testing all the pieces to see how they look. This next part I kind of struggled with. I would do it differently than what I did if I did it again. First I cut out a basic shape of 5mm foam, and then I layered 2mm foam on top of it with the vallus and the other little vents cut out. But if I were to redo it, I would probably layer 2 pieces of 2mm foam instead, or I would just carve out the vallus and vents with my X-Acto knife and heat gun instead. This was me making the 2mm foam overlay that would sit over it. Which again, not a huge fan of how this turned out, so I would do it differently if I did it again. These letters ended up being a lot more annoying than I thought they would. I would probably carve them out instead of completely cutting them out, or just paint them on instead. Doing a little bit of sanding, seeing if the 2mm overlay was working. And yeah, this part took forever, which is why I don't recommend doing it. It also didn't turn out looking that good, which is another reason I would recommend not doing it. Like the Sharpie on there just looks so much cleaner, which is why I think paint, just plain paint, would be a better way to go. Oh yeah, I had to redo the tracing on there since I did it the wrong way. Which made it really hard to trace. I don't really have any tips for cutting with the X-Acto knife. It's pretty hard, to be honest. I traced the trigger thingy out of 5mm foam. Just cut it, it's really easy to make. It's the perfect thickness, I thought. It's nice and sturdy too, and it fit right in there perfectly. So to figure out that kind of curved silver and pink shape, that's kind of hard to do because they're 3D objects. So I decided to make a pattern by wrapping the gun handle in painter's tape. But I would recommend wrapping it in saran wrap first because otherwise it's really hard to get the tape off. And you can kind of see me struggle with it once I start cutting the tape off. I didn't follow the guide I printed out exactly because it looked kind of weird, but I tried to get pretty close to it, just adjusting things a little bit so they looked better in real life. Yeah, so here you can see me struggling to get the tape off because I didn't saran wrap first. But this allows you to turn a 3D shape into a 2D pattern. For the pink part, I ended up with this weird kind of ugly heart, and for the silver part, I ended up with a weird banana peel shape. And I cleaned it up a little and copied it onto paper to make a new pattern. And I tested it out, of course, and it worked. This is me testing out my carving technique in the 5mm foam, and when you heat it up with the heat gun and press it down with a pen, it creates a deep recess, which looks really good. So I'm finally doing that on all of the pieces that I cut out. Which you can hopefully see. This was actually really fun. I enjoyed carving it out. You can see just how much they open up with the heat. For the tiny little rivets, I took a small sanding drill bit on my Dremel and just sanded for a second to create them. Really quick and easy. And that's what they look like when they're heated up. They open up the rivet mark a little bit more. Here I was testing if I was going to carve out the clover symbol or not, but I decided that my X-Acto knife work wasn't clean enough, so I decided just to paint it on later, which I think was the right call. For a lot of the pieces I just use hot glue. You could use contact cement if you want it to be more sturdy, but I find that hot glue works well enough. And you don't have to wait for it to dry. Testing the fit before I was gluing stuff on. ended up cutting that a little shorter because I didn't like how much it overhang. And I wanted to show a little bit of the gun underneath. Doing the other side. And here's that overlay piece that I talked about that I didn't like. Next, I decided to work on the golden wing. So I cut out the round little base part and the wing separately. I'm going to trace the wing onto 2mm foam and the little round part onto 5mm foam. I think if I were to redo the round part, I would consider using foam clay instead, but I don't know if foam clay was out when I made the gun initially, or maybe it wasn't available in the US yet, but either way I didn't have it and I was trying to get it done for a con, so I just made do with what I had. But you could use other types of clay too. For the wing line markings, I cut through the foam a little, but I made sure not to cut through all the way, which is hard to do, but managed. And then to make those lines pronounced, use the heat gun. So yeah, I traced it onto the 5mm scraps. And then I did that little round part onto 2mm foam. I then sanded them to get it more rounded. Did a lot of sanding to get them really rounded. And then I glued the wing underneath the little oval that I cut out. These definitely aren't perfect, but I do think it shows that you can actually do a lot just with basic foam. You don't necessarily need a bunch of fancy materials, as long as you have a Dremel. Oh, and then I started working on the handle pieces. I glued the banana peel shape thing shut just with some contact cement before gluing it on. And then I think I ended up trimming the pink handle part a little bit. Which is a bit hard to see here, but I didn't like the shape of it once I had it on the foam and with everything. I also sanded the edges so that they wouldn't be flat, so that they would be rounded and look more like a handle. And then I sanded the edges on the other handle part as well to do the same thing. Marked the rivets. Glued it on. And then I use that drill bit to make that big rivet on the handle. And then I put in just a regular drill bit to drill the hole through the gun. And I put foam under it to make sure that I wouldn't go into the table. Oh yeah, so now I'm gluing the wing onto the little round piece. I glued it a little bit lower so that the gun could help support the wing and keep that straight. I made the trigger out of epoxy sculpt, as well as a few other gun-like details. And E6000 is a really strong glue, but it does take 24 hours to dry. But I wanted to use the strongest glue I had for the trigger parts. So that's what I used there. And then I put some foam underneath it to kind of prop it up. Did you see me doing? And that's it.